It's not often that I go out and find a new anime out of randomness. Typically, when I watch an anime, it'll be something that I've had my eye on or written down somewhere in my backlog, only to be forgotten about until I happen to decide it's time to give it a watch. But this time, it was neither of those. In January, I looked at this graphic of what animes were airing for the winter 2026 season, and Roll Over and Die was the lucky pick, maybe because of that very bold title. I read a short synopsis on my anime list and proceeded to watch what would become out to be one of the most interesting series that I've come across through its flawed anime and potential that it didn't quite reach. Roll Over and Die, I Will Fight for an Ordinary Life with My Love and Cursed Sword, or Roll Over and Die, is a dark fantasy and Yuri light novel series written by Kiki and illustrated by Kinta and Kodamazan. Originating as a web novel series on the Japanese self-publishing novel platform Shosetsuka ni Naro in January 2018, it was acquired by Japanese publisher Micro Magazine and is officially completed with 8 volumes. The anime was done by Studio ACGT and began airing on January 9, 2026 to March 27, 2026 with a 12-episode run. The story revolves around Plum Apricot, a once nobody girl living in the countryside until one day she was chosen by the god Origin to be a part of the hero's party to defeat the Demon Lord. Everyone in this world is born with an affinity, with common ones being more elemental based like water or grass. And there are rare affinities, one of which was gifted to Flum, Reversal. Except, it never seemed to bring her any benefit, and in fact her stats were always kept at 0 no matter what she did. She could never cast any magic or fight, and thus she was seemingly useless to her party. Recognizing and being angered at Flum's incompetence, the hero party's sage, John Inteji, betrayed Flum and sold her into slavery, with a permanent branding that could never be erased. Unfortunately, Flum's suffering wouldn't end there, as she was even seemingly useless as a slave. Being thrown into a prison cell to die by a wave of ghouls, or die by melting through wielding a cursed sword, Flum chose to fight to the very end. As Flum grabbed the sword and everything seemed to be over, the sword instantly healed her injuries, and she came to understand how her affinity truly worked. After defeating the ghouls and her former master, she was free to live once again. Meanwhile, another girl in the same cell, Milkith, witnessed everything that had just occurred. Being a slave her whole life, she had nowhere to go and nowhere to turn to. She caught Flum's attention because of how beautiful her eyes were. Yes, really. And Flum, not wanting to be alone, decided to take Milkith with her, with Milkith's condition being that Flum would now be her master, as her twisted common sense couldn't understand a person wanting her without that designation. Together, the two set forth on their new adventure to start over and reclaim a normal life. And though the physical and mental scars would last, at least the two had each other. Roll Over and Die has a fairly generic setup for what you'd expect to be another run-of-the-mill fantasy comeback plot. That being the betrayal, weak protagonists to later discover their true powers and reclaim what was theirs. But I think the ideas that this anime presents, while not necessarily groundbreaking, do go a long way in giving you a sense of potential vastness of the setting and possible interesting setups given Flum's reversal powers. Flum's character arc over the course of the anime is not a major one, but it's decent. The kicked out of the party and weakest ability trope is a pretty standard one, and there's nothing you won't expect if you already know how those play out. What I do like about what they did with Flum is by keeping her somewhat realistic, in that because she has low stats, there's a much larger risk for her to fight whatever creatures she's put up against. They're willing to show the brutal consequences for a low-ranked adventurer like Flum to go against a powerful ogre or werewolf by getting her limbs torn off. Granted, she has the gift of healing herself with her cursed weapon, but it still feels like there's a sense of danger. Flum is also somewhat of a morally gray character. Even though she helps out the townspeople and will go the lengths to save her friends and stick it to the big bad guys, she's not afraid to cut someone down if they never learn. I really like this aspect to her character because it gives more depth and shows she's also succumbed to the survival of the fittest nature the world has forced her in. Unfortunately, I don't think it's as developed as much as I'd like it to, but I love that it's here nonetheless. To the anime's credit though, there is the scene of Flum killing 2 of Dane's men, despite Sarah trying to stop her. Flum telling Sarah that some people just won't learn is a really powerful move for Flum's stance on her morals. It's also kind of disturbing, but also depressing when you remember that Sarah is only 10. On a side note, I think Flum's voice actress is great. She's voiced by Ayaka Nanase, and though I've never heard her voice before, I think she does a great job. Those screams that she mostly does in the first half of the anime really took me by surprise. Ironically, the most unique part of Flum's character is held together by a somewhat flimsy ultimatum. That being that apparently nobody else has ever thought of the proper use for Flum's powers. I think this is the one breaking point that can ruin the experience for some people, and it kind of asks you to look past that. They say Flum has a rare affinity, but surely she's not the only person in the world to have it if they know it exists. Maybe they address it in the light novel, but I wouldn't know. Milkit is a nice solid character and has a nice subtle character arc throughout the story. She really did start from the very bottom, so there's a lot of freedom to take her character from a blank slate. The gradual shift from her predisposed behavior as someone who wasn't allowed to speak out and have her own desires, to someone being strong-willed enough to at least somewhat stand up on her own is done pretty well. With Milkit being the main love interest, I think the growth of her and Flum's relationship is nice. I don't have much to say about it, but I can say that they've got some good, if not a bit, cliche scenes. A lot of the side characters are unfortunately not touched on much, and I can only presume it's because of how much content the studio was tasked with covering. Characters like Sarah and Ink do get their deserved growth, but others like Eterna and even John, who brought on what started the whole plot, don't have much going for them. I'm not expecting the story to be able to make every single character have their big developments, but there's a lot of setups for characters that seem interesting and they don't get payoffs simply because it's an adaptation of a much larger narrative. Though this is supposed to be a dark fantasy, there's also a lot of slice of life in this anime. It's to a point where you'd almost forget you are watching an anime that's rated R17 at times. It's not necessarily a bad thing because the slice of life elements give a nice break from the bleakness and tension. Despite the terrible circumstances, there's still a feeling of hopefulness that everything will be okay in the end. I can understand, however, if these tonal shifts in the story can feel a bit off-putting, especially if you're going in with the mindset of expecting a story that's very heavy all around. The opening would even make you inclined to believe so. The use of the narrator in the anime is mostly redundant. I don't know if the studio chose to go this route because the light novel had one, but in a light novel, you aren't given much visual information through scenes or art like an anime, so the narrator makes sense to describe the setting and be omniscient so the reader can better understand the character's actions or feelings. In an anime adaptation, however, you can easily just let the characters or scenes speak for themselves, and I think some scenes would have benefited without the telling instead of showing. I can understand having a third-person narrator for explanations about the workings of the kingdom and church or parts like the power system because that's not information that would be known to the main cast, but other than that, it feels off. Sometimes, they even try to dramatize the scenes by utilizing the narrator. The one that comes to mind for me is in episode 4 when Flum gathers her strength for one last strike, and the anime does this back and forth between Flum's monologue and the narrator. And while I'm sure it reads better on paper, and by paper I mean literally on the book paper, it doesn't hit the same, and they could have just had Flum say those lines as well. They do begin to use the narrator sparingly in the second half, and I think that shift was one for the better. This anime's world and lore are actually one of the most interesting parts about the anime to me. There's a significant emphasis on circumstances happening outside of the protagonist's domain, through stories told about the kingdom and church, the divided society of the capital, and the demon war that all bring about a sense of scale to this world. In the first episode, we only really get an idea of this so-called origin that has chosen Flum, and in the second half of the episode, the church's mission is to defeat the demon lord and their cult-like ideology is then exposed to us. As the episodes progress, even by episode 3, it's made very clear that the governing bodies of the world are, at the very least, morally ambiguous, only to then be shown off later that they are far from the good guys either. It's not like this sort of thing hasn't been done before, but it does give off that sense of wonder that any other fictional world would. Even other characters like the Knights of the Church and Milkit's previous owners, there's so much to this world that's set up for us to think about. But this unfortunately ties into the faults of the anime adaptation, because there's just too much here for too little time to spend to try and tackle everything. The anime's climax and resolution comes way too quickly and within the last 2 episodes. The second half of the anime feels very rushed and kinda goes from 0 to 100 real quick, but not in a good way. The first half did a decent job on the flow of the story, but then it's as if the production team realized they needed to get to the big climax of Dane vs. Flum and the resolution for Ink, so they had to shoehorn it all in to give the main cast a happy ending. Not only do the events of Flum's story have much less of an emotional impact with this quick pacing, but it leaves a lot to be desired from the story's world. There's still so many unanswered questions that this anime brought on, and it left me wanting a lot more. Now, sure, you can give a lot more exposition in a novel than you can in a 12-episode anime, but we're only given enough of the lore to understand the roles of the people and powers in the story. The studio likely had to pick and choose what to prioritize for the adaptation, as they probably weren't expecting a renewal for this anime, leaving certain plot points more expanded on than others. Speaking of the 12-episode run, I think that's a major part of why this anime was doomed to be left feeling a bit unsatisfying, because this is the kind of story that yearns for a longer ongoing adaptation, or at least a second season. But that was almost never going to happen given this very non-mainstream, albeit still successful, series. ACGT, the animation studio behind the anime, did a passable job with what they were tasked with doing given how low of a budget they probably had. You may know them best from their work on Initial D 4th Stage. Gosh, why does everything always lead back to Initial D? In a world full of solo levelings and re-zeros, it's hard not to look down on this anime for being just slop. Excuse my French. But on its own, the animation for Rollover and Die is serviceable. It's not great, but it gets the job done. Occasionally, the action shots will have some better looking effects and fluidity, and it's nice to see those glimpses of higher quality when they appear. An actual complaint that I do have is that the shadows and dark settings are way too dark. When a scene takes place at night, or the characters are in an area with no light exposure, anything that's also dark colored will be very difficult to look at. It's a pretty bad mistake that occurs throughout the anime. Maybe you could argue this saves time in drawing detail, but this shows incompetence over laziness. Another odd choice the anime did was fog up nearly the entire frame for a couple of scenes in episodes 10 and 11. In episode 10, it was more acceptable because it was paired with the mystery of the disappearances, and it could be interpreted as a way of emphasizing the uncertainty of the situation, but it's likely that the anime was trying to save costs for the actual fight scenes in the last two episodes. The episode also used these cloud backgrounds that took up a significant portion whenever Flum's mind would be clouded because of the uncertainty and hopelessness of everyone's disappearance. These are pretty jarring and do take you out of the episode for a bit, because this is probably the anime's worst case of how the budget affected the presentation of the anime. I get that they probably weren't working with much, and you could give the benefit of the doubt, but it doesn't take away from how poor of a decision this was. I didn't even mention the fact that the warm colors of the background contrast the emotions of doubt and hopelessness that Flum and the audience is trying to feel. Episode 11 features an entire fight scene in the fog, and it's as underwhelming as you'd expect. Speaking of violence, the light novel has some pretty gruesome depictions of gore, and the anime didn't really seem to deliver much on that front. There is blood shown and occasionally limbs being torn off, but there's not much more than that. Ironically, the opening is probably the most gory that the anime ever gets. The anime does feature the body horror from the light novel, and I think it's alright. Compared to the light novel's depiction, and what you're seeing on screen is the censored 7 Seas Entertainment version by the way, the anime is pretty watered down. I did like how they showed Flum cut her arm off in its entirety in episode 2. I don't know if it would be right for me to say it's cool, but it definitely caught me off guard because I did not think that they'd be willing to go that far even for this dark fantasy plot. I don't know if it really is the budget or if TV broadcasting restrictions would have played a part in watering down the gore, but either way, it kind of muddles down the dark theme that the anime is supposed to follow. Not to say that gore is the only way to be considered dark, of course. All of these issues that I've had with the anime and its narrative left me wanting more, so I turned to the Wikipedia article of this series, and while I haven't properly read a novel since high school, I found that there is a manga adaptation that has a decent amount of chapters and is supposedly still ongoing. It began in December 2018, the same year as the light novel. It was also written by Kiki, but this time illustrated by Sunao Minakata, who has done art for a couple of other Yuri manga stories, including another series that received an anime adaptation, Akuma no Riddle. I gave the Rollover and Die manga a read, and I can confidently say that this is a major improvement over the anime, though that's not very high of a bar to get over. Just for reference, the version I read and what you'll be seeing on screen is the official 7 Seas Entertainment localization, and I'm not aware of any fan translations for the manga. As of writing this script, there are 31 chapters and 7 volumes of the manga that have been localized. Right away, the manga addresses a lot of complaints that I had regarding the writing and story. It starts out very similar to the anime, but the lore and power systems are actually explained much more thoroughly in the manga, probably because they have a lot more freedom to take the time needed to do so. It wasn't until reading the manga that I finally understood John's motivation to get rid of Flum, that being he wants to marry Kirill because they're both from noble bloodlines. This was touched on in the anime, but either the anime's dialogue didn't make it all that clear, or the subtitles I was reading didn't communicate that well. Oh, the poor doomed Yuri. Flum here seems to be written a bit more morally gray than her anime counterpart, and I actually like this better than how the anime kept her portrayal to more of a hero. Both adaptations still mostly keep Flum as a morally good person, but there's occasional times in the manga where Flum does not pull her punches and goes full vengeance mode. In general, Flum seems to be written with a bit more depth than the anime. There's a small scene where Flum still thinks about her first kill, and it's a nice display of her guilty conscience playing a part in how to move on in this kill or be killed world. Flum is also depicted to be more insecure, like not wanting to tell Eterna she was kicked out by John for being useless, and Milky uplifting Flum for feeling as though she doesn't deserve the rewards she's gained. A big plus to the manga is how emotion is conveyed. Comparing this to the anime, it's not even close. I love how the emotion of fear is so much more apparent to the reader, and all those scenes of doubt and hopelessness make that much more of an impact because of it. There's a page in chapter 7 that really stood out to me where Sarah's moment of realization and fear that her healing was inverted was expressed so much better in the manga. And the panels of Flum in desperation seeing the ogre approach as she's contemplating on what to do so that Sarah doesn't die is so good, I'm surprised they didn't include that in the anime. The art in general is really good, and now just off of this alone, Minakata has become a new favorite artist of mine. The action scenes are great, the gore is more gruesome, although not too far, and most importantly, you can actually see the scenes that take place at night. There's a lot of other small observations that I made while reading the manga in comparison to the anime. Rather than the narrator in the anime, the manga is almost entirely in first person from Flum's point of view. In the manga, Gaudio is shown attacking with Cavalier arts earlier, which is a better setup for Flum executing hers in the fight against the Spiral Ogre. There's a bonus story in the first manga volume that's in novel format about Flum and Kirill baking cakes, and also about Maria's big personalities. It actually got a couple chuckles out of me, and I can't believe that I actually got duped into reading a short novel story. But it stood out to me because this bonus story got somewhat of a partial adaptation in a small flashback, even down to the details about Maria having cake on her face and John's last line in the story being said out loud. Not sure if this sequence was just a flashback in the light novel, but the similarities were too much for me not to notice. As of right now, the English localized manga isn't caught up to the story where the anime is, and instead added many manga original scenes, though I'm not sure if some of them came from the light novel instead, and reconstructed many story beats to occur sooner or later. On its own, I don't think it's that bad of a change, and I don't mind the manga adaptation deviating from the source material as long as it still tells a good story and keeps the core of the original, but this does mean that the manga hasn't even fully covered the events of the second light novel volume. Just like the anime, the manga is susceptible to some pacing issues, not only in covering the events of the light novel but also in some of its quick turnarounds. It is a little disappointing because keep in mind, the manga started in 2018. Granted, this is serialized in a monthly magazine, but it seems as though progress from a narrative adaptation perspective has been quite sluggish. What's interesting about these differences though is that Kiki is still the writer of the manga, so I can only assume that the changes made were ones they may have wanted to retroactively change in the story, or just experiment, which I can respect, assuming there was no editorial meddling going on. And on the topic of the light novel, it seems the anime covered the first 2 volumes. I can't actually confirm that for myself because I haven't read them fully, but I am willing to trust the testimony of several Reddit strangers. I did, however, decide to read the first 2 chapters and the first intermission of the light novel out of curiosity, and because I was actually able to find it somewhere online. Immediately, there's a significant difference in the light novel because chapter 1 sets up the story and setting before getting into the inciting incident at the end of the chapter. Elements like the routine of the party going back and forth and Flum's persistence to keep up with the party despite her stats is shown in the anime, but either never explained or not conveyed very effectively. This definitely works better in the format of a light novel, though I think the way the adaptations handled it by starting at the inciting incident could be preferable and attention-grabbing to some, especially in those formats that are made to have a more snappy pace. John is made out to be simultaneously more menacing and incompetent in certain tasks, showing new sides to his character and revealing that he isn't so high and mighty all around as he might seem. Also, turns out the Kirill he loves is 16 and he's 28, so yeah, I don't have any sympathy for him. The other party members are characterized a little differently in the bit of the novel that I read. In the first chapter, it reveals that most of the party besides Kirill dismissed Flum whenever she would help out, and it portrays them in a bit of a more negative side than the manga or anime did. Gadio and Eterna are still the ones shown to be more sympathetic to Flum, which is eventually depicted later on in the manga and anime adaptations. But the implication is more obvious here in the start of the light novel that they'll become significant returning characters to Flum's aid. After reading the manga, a bit of the light novel, and reading people online talk about this series, it seems that the anime is sort of a mishmash adaptation of both. It seems to follow the manga a bit more closely at times, like in the beginning where it completely ditches almost the entire first chapter of the light novel, but also seems to start sticking more to the light novel in the second half of the anime. Though this is supposed to be an adaptation of the original source material, it's obvious HCGT probably had to reference the manga at least a little bit, because to my knowledge there are certain characters and scenes not visually depicted in the light novel's illustrations. Roll Over and Die is a textbook case of the flawed, non-mainstream light novel adaptation. They're like the movie tie-in video games of anime. While the source material may be great, or cookie cutter, these seemingly churned out subpar animes leave a lot to be desired. There's even a decent following for this light novel series, and I'm sure it hits harder for some of them than for me. It's even more of a shame when you see that there's a lot of potential based on the writing alone that gives hints of how good the light novel may be. I'm not saying adaptations should be one-to-one with the source material and cover absolutely everything, but Roll Over and Die's adaptation didn't get the chance to really make itself shine. The low budget, poor direction, and lack of exposure because of a seemingly generic plot were all working against the anime from the start. In a perfect world, all of these potential stories would have the greatest adaptations that they deserved. But then I guess that wouldn't be a perfect world because where would we be without lower quality media? It's hard to look past the flaws of Roll Over and Die's adaptation, and while I've been here pushing the potential agenda, there is still a lot in what was given to us that can be worth enjoying, especially if you're into dark elements, world building, and Yuri. So that's it for the video. If you want me to cover any mid or diamond in the rough animes, feel free to let me know, or just any animes in general. One-shot reviews will be making a comeback starting next month. These bigger back-to-back videos have been planned for months, hence why that series has been on a bit of a hold. And I think that's it. Thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time. Take care.